Good Tuesday morning, doorknobs. Today is April 7th, 2020. I believe it's day 17 of our quarantine. Hopefully, you're still getting something out of these lessons. Today, our goal is to talk about Congressional Reconstruction and daily life of freedmen. I did cut a little bit of stuff out because I wanted to actually try to keep it a little bit shorter today. So we'll see if I can live up to that promise. I'm going to try to stay in the 16-minute range instead of the 21-minute range. You do have an assignment for me, super stupid, simple, quick. Comment on the stream in Google Classroom something that stood out to you from today's lesson. So nothing that you need to submit, just type a quick, couple words, a sentence or so, something that you thought was interesting or stood out to you from today's lesson. So if you remember back to our prior lesson, yesterday's video, we learned about Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, which was super simple, that malice toward none and charity for all. So let's not blame anyone and let's be good to everyone. Let's give of all of ourselves. Let's all help rebuild all of the destruction of the America from the standpoint of human lives all the way to infrastructure, roads and bridges and railroads and stuff like that. So he made it simple, or tried to, and tried to incorporate into that help for African Americans who had very little before. When he died, Andrew Johnson took over, and Johnson's plan was similar-ish, but nobody liked Andrew Johnson, and we're going to come back to that in a little bit. And also, his did not have anything to do with the Freedmen's Bureau. So the big differences there was the Freedmen's Bureau and the fact that Lincoln was a powerful figure in America. So Andrew Johnson, not really so much. So amnesty to most whites. About 90% of white Southerners who applied for a pardon from Andrew Johnson were given a pardon just by pledging loyalty. I pledge allegiance to the flag. That's pretty simple to pledge your loyalty, even if you don't necessarily mean it. Okay, so Southern states of the black codes, that was in our discussion today in our Zoom. Black codes exist in places today. We don't call them black codes. We sometimes call them Jim Crow laws. It's sort of almost like the examples that were used in Zoom for those of you that were in the session today, almost like a hypocrite where teachers can chew gum, or teachers can have their cell phones, or your parents can do things that you're not allowed to do. It's kind of like that on a super simplified version, though most of the time black codes and Jim Crow laws were intended to not just coerce or convince someone to do something, but in some instances even cause harm. Okay, so Congress's plan for Reconstruction was the harshest of the three. It did not allow representation from the South. In fact, Southern states were all given to the command of Union military generals. So the Union military controlled all of the South and forced upon the Southerners things like the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment. So anytime that the Southern states are going to ask for something, even when it comes to creating their own state legislatures and electing their own governor and appointing people to their own Congress or their Senate or their House of Representatives, they had to agree to pass the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act. And that leads us to this picture here. That this guy is called a carpetbagger. I'm going to explain what that is in just a minute. This would be a carpetbag. It's sort of like a suitcase or a duffel bag. A carpetbagger was a derogatory term. So it's like a naughty name, except not really that naughty. What a carpetbagger was a northerner who went into the South looking to make a profit off of the devastation of the war. So the closest thing I can give you, and this isn't always a negative, but the closest comparison I can give you, or analogy I can give you to a carpetbagger would be when the big hailstorm came through in 2014. And every house in Blair needed a new roof and new siding and new windows. It wasn't just the Blair carpenters and the Blair roofers that did the work to fix all of the houses in Blair. There were construction companies from Missouri and from Iowa and Kansas, from all over the place, that were coming in and filling up our motels and making a lot of money throwing roofs on houses. They're carpetbaggers. For the Blair economy, they weren't a good thing. They weren't bringing in uh, money and keeping it in Blair. They were making their money and sending it back to Kansas or Iowa or South Dakota or wherever their crew was from. Even a few crews from Texas, I know, were in Blair for that hailstorm, working on cars and houses. And you see the picture of this guy here, the image of this guy. They make him kind of look like a weasel because he's bringing his suitcase. He's living in a hotel or out of a boarding house, maybe back in the old days, and he's making money off of Reconstruction. The other group were called scalawags. So if someone called you a scalawag or a carpetbagger, that was a negative thing. A scalawag is a Southerner who supports radical Reconstruction. So the closest analogy I can give you to a scalawag in today's modern terminology, a scalawag is like a suck up. Someone who, when the teacher says, "Class, I need someone to do a chore for me," they're the first ones to raise their hand, and they're almost drooling at the idea that they get to help out because they think that it gets them, bonus points or something. So these were whites, and they were hated within the South because they were sucking up to the Union, and in return, sometimes getting political appointments and contracts to rebuild railroads and stuff like that. So oftentimes businessmen finding a way to make money off of Reconstruction. By 1870, under Congressional Reconstruction, all the southern states were back in Congress. So it took it took 15 full years, 5 full years to get the southern states back in. Now, I talked about briefly before, and I'm trying to hurry through this, that Johnson was not all that popular in Congress. First of all, being from North Carolina, being from a southern state that had seceded, he was not a secesh, but being from a state that had seceded, that didn't help him out very much. So when Johnson became president, he kept all of Abraham Lincoln's cabinet. Remember, a cabinet is just a group of advisors. And I'm going to simplify this as much as I can for you. A group of advisors. So Congress, the House and the Senate, passed a law to catch the guy. They set a trap for him. They called it the Tenure of Office Act. What that said is that the President of the United States did not have the authority, in simple terms, to fire someone who worked for him. That's wrong. It doesn't make any sense. If you're a cabinet member, you're appointed by the president. You're selected by the president because he wants your advice. At the point when the president decides he doesn't want your advice, he has the power to get rid of you. So Johnson was impeached because he fired the Secretary of, I believe it was the Secretary of War, a guy named Edwin Stanton. The House of Representatives voted to impeach him. We've had this discussion 10,000 times before, and still some people are confused by it. An impeachment does not mean kicked out. It just simply means to be accused of something. It's sort of like if you're arrested and taken to jail, you're innocent until you're proven guilty in a court of law. That's a modern ideology. Was back then too. The Senate then holds a trial to determine whether or not you're convicted. This guy misses being convicted by one vote, so he barely holds on. And as a result of nearly getting removed from office, he didn't have much power and was never reelected. So he served out the rest of Abraham Lincoln's term as president and never had any more authority. Who else has been impeached? Well, there have been others. Here's a picture with a question. Were they all formally impeached? This is where I would pause and I'd let the class look at the pictures. Obviously, I added President Trump on there because he wasn't on there until a few months ago. But no, they were not all formally impeached. Andrew Johnson was impeached and not convicted for breaking the Tenure of Office Act. Richard Nixon did some sneakier stuff, and if we get a little time later toward the end of the school year, we'll talk a little bit about Nixon. Nixon would have been impeached, and Nixon would have likely been convicted. He would have been convicted, but he resigned first. So it's sort of like if I'm a teacher and I punch a student in the nose for no reason, and someone goes running down to the office to get Dr. Stogdill, chances are if I punched a student in the nose, I'm going to get fired. So before Dr. Stogdill can fire me, I'm just going to quit. That way, maybe when I go to apply for another job somewhere and they ask, why did you leave your previous job? I don't have to say I got fired because they're going to say, why'd you get fired? I punched a kid in the nose. They're not going to hire me as a school teacher. So instead, I can honestly, truthfully say, if I quit first, I can say, I just didn't like the atmosphere there, didn't get along with some of the people. And that might be enough to get me the job. So that isn't necessarily the reason why Nixon did it, but he would have been impeached and he would have been convicted. President Clinton was also impeached. He committed, he um, allegedly committed a crime called perjury. Perjury means lying under oath. So Clinton was impeached for committing perjury. He was not convicted. Not convicted. And then we just went through the very brief Senate trial and the House investigation of President Trump. And President Trump was impeached and he was not convicted. So in all of the history of all of the United States, we've only had 3 U.S. presidents impeached, and one of them in your lifetime, 2 of them in my lifetime. But of the 4 on here, Richard Nixon was not formally tried. I'll put this up here just for a minute. I'll put the notes in before you take your quiz on Thursday. Black codes, laws that limit the freedom of slaves, ex-slaves, scalawag. It's like a brown nose or a suck-up. Carpetbagger was a northerner looking for wealth and power, and amnesty is to pardon. By the way, Richard Nixon was pardoned for committing the crimes that he did commit by his replacement. Impeach is to accuse, not to kick out, and veto is to prevent from becoming a law. So now that we have a daily life, now that Reconstruction is underway, what's life like? Well, now that you're a slave, first of all, study the picture over here. This is Andrew Johnson, and he's kicking another name for a cabinet is a bureau. And you can see it says freedmen's, and you've got these little teeny tiny, what appear to be little African Americans. They're little people compared to him because they're not equal. He's kicking it out. He doesn't believe in the Freedmen's Bureau. But you do not need permission to leave the plantation. You don't have to have a pass. Just go. You can legally marry as long as it was another black woman or another freed woman or freed man. There were no laws against that. And children and adults could attend freedmen's schools. So life becomes what appears to be kind of almost normal. Here's a marriage certificate for freedmen and those of abandoned lands to certify that George Rapier and Anne Rapier have this day appeared me under blah, blah, blah to be married. Another declaration of marriage of Negroes and mulattoes. A mulatto is half black or half different. Here's a Freedmen's Bureau school. So all these little black children getting an opportunity to get an education. And then you got bad guys that don't want blacks having opportunities for education because that would ultimately lead to equality, burning a freedmen's school. And the idea here of racism and this is a white man's government, and these guys, a vote, he's got a stick, and this guy's got a knife. I don't know why this guy looks like a monkey, but they're standing on top of a black man and an American flag. We regard the Constitution and the Congress's usurpations of unconstitutional, revolutionary, and void. Or here, the popular idea of Freedmen's Bureau, plenty to eat and nothing to do. So if you're a black man, this is posted in white newspapers all across the country. All you got to do is sit around and you got corn and flour and pork over here in the barrel and pick the banjo and relax at the Freedmen's Bureau. So there were misinterpretations of what it was actually like. There was a bank, I'm not going to spend my time on this, but as freedmen were learning to save money, they were investing in this bank, which eventually failed and they all lost their money by 1899. They had a lot of money. One of the other things the Freedmen's Bureau was really good at was interpreting documents. So when an ex-slave was no longer a slave, they were oftentimes set to look for work. And one of the problems they had is they were contract laborers. So let's just pretend for a minute that I'm a cotton grower in the South. And my slaves are all set free. I had a whole bunch, and now I have none. I have an opportunity, but I need the workers, so I'm going to have to pay them. So I'm going to write a contract with my ex-workers for pay. And the contract might say something like, I'm going to give you the South 40. You can go farm the South 40 over there. Um, Kenna and Derek, you can go over there and farm the South 40. And you can have the shed. You can build a little house over there and have your 7 little children, whatever, how many little kids you want. And I'm going to let you keep half of whatever you grow. I get the other half. That's called sharecropping. We're going to come into that in just a minute. Um, it sounds like a pretty good system. The problem is when Derek needs to plant the cotton or to plow the field, he doesn't own a plow and he doesn't own a horse. So he comes to me and says, "Can I borrow a plow and a horse?" Well, sure, but that's going to cost you another 5% of your crop. So now I get 55%, he gets 45%. Then he needs seed to plant his cotton. Okay, that's another 5%. Oh, we're up to 60-40. Then the kids need shoes. So he borrows a little bit of money. Now it's 65-35. And by the time he harvests his crop, I get to keep almost all of it. So the Freedmen's Bureau would read contracts. Before you sign a contract, make sure it's fair. Make sure, as the freedman, you're not getting cheated because you likely can't read that contract and don't even necessarily have a signature to put on it. There was this popular idea that all freedmen should receive 40 acres and a mule. So take all these gigantic plantations and divide them up. Don't let the rich keep them anymore. Divide them up. Sort of a version of socialism today, and give all that property to those freedmen. However, in the end, most got no land, and they were paid by contract. Again, make sure the Freedmen's Bureau reads it to make sure it's legal, or at least a fair deal. Paid a low wage to work, and most of the time they worked as sharecroppers. Sharecropping was only slightly better than slavery because they could not escape poverty. If they had a bad year and there was no crop, they're all of a sudden in debt to the plantation owner or the master with no way to pay it back. It's a picture of what life would be like probably for you guys if you were black children and this were the 1870s, 80s, 90s, even into the early 1900s. These big long bags are used to pick the cotton. These are called cotton bolls, BOLL, and you pick them all by hand. Today there are machines that do that. And then you've got here the plantation owner and the sharecroppers, and he's weighing out the crop, probably to determine which part is his share. And then he would either pay them for their portion of the crop, or they could maybe even sell it on the open market. Good deal for the plantation owner. This is just an image of one state and the percentage of sharecrop farms in that state. The darker it is, the higher the percentage of land that was sharecropped. I always think this is cute. I don't think this is a little black child, so not all sharecroppers were African American or freedmen. This is, I think, a little white girl, but it's a cute little picture. But no shoes, walking through the field, picking cotton. That bag probably weighs as much as she does. She's dragging behind her. But even little children have to pull their weight. And I'm not really very good at this, but I'm guessing by her size, she's probably like 7. Can't imagine too many 7-year-olds working that hard. And again, we have a percentage of sharecrop farms throughout the southern states, or most of the southern states. We see very heavy concentration of sharecropping in parts of South Carolina, parts of North Carolina, large parts of Georgia, and even over into Texas. Not so much in Louisiana and Arkansas, except for a few hotbeds of heavy sharecropping. And that leads us into the last slide for today, and we'll continue on with this theme with tomorrow's lesson, with Wednesday's lesson, violent racism and the creation of the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan was actually, we call it a terrorist group today. It still exists today, by the way. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. But it was created by an ex-Confederate general named Nathan Bedford Forrest, which, by the way, I'm not sure exactly the number, but Nathan Bedford Forrest held a record during the Civil War for having the most number of horses shot out from under him. I believe it was 27 or 29. If you're really bored, you can look that up. You could post that in the stream. But 27 horses shot out from under him. If you were the horse corral and you saw Nathan Bedford Forrest headed toward the corral, you go hide because you don't want to be his horse. Anyway, he started the KKK, or was one of the men that started it, and they like to hide their identity, and they practiced lynchings or killing by hangings, and their goal was to keep Republicans from the polls. Their goal was to keep blacks from voting. So we're going to go into greater detail on this later, but the creation of it comes right after the Civil War as an attempt to keep those constitutional rights, especially the 13th Amendment, the freeing of slaves. They're all free. Keeping their citizenship, 14th Amendment, and later on the 15th Amendment, their right to vote, away from them. Legally, they couldn't say you can't vote, so they found ways like using intimidation and lynching and hiding their identities to do it. So we'll go into more detail on that later. You guys have a wonderful day. Make sure you post a comment in the stream section of Google Classroom for today's lesson. I appreciate all the hard work you guys do. Enjoy the weather outside today, get some fresh air, and let's kick this virus out of here. Have a good day.